After the drama of the safety lamp, George Stephenson turned back to his beloved engines. However, he was more interested in moving engines rather than static ones. He followed the papers and notices of Trevithick and his marvellous locomotive, and of course the success from Blenkinsop. In 1813, he was asked by his bosses to build a locomotive in the Killingworth workshop. He had studied his predecessor's works and pulled up several design flaws as well as some redeeming qualities. He pulled it all together in an engine called Vulture. George studied its performance and he wasn't happy. It could pull more than the average horse, but at 4 miles an hour it wasn't quick, so the collieries saw little profit from it, and for George it was a learning curve. The engine, though, did grab the attention of William Losh. William was a senior partner of an ironworks in Newcastle. He offered George a role in the works as an engineer part-time with a decent salary and splitting the profits and the patents in a 50-50 split. Stephenson agreed and put his name to several new components. By the age of 40, he was well accomplished in the complexities of steam locomotion and was well placed to advise and make improvements. He was making a name for himself. And it was around this time he received an invitation that would elevate him from engineer to household name. On the 19th of April, George was called to meet railway prospect Edward Pease. Edward was one of the benefactors for the newly assented Stockton and Darlington railway. The ascension granted the railway the building rights, the running powers, and its wording left the power to the trains in the hands of the bosses. There was lots of options. Horsepower was the norm, but winching engines were also an option. Finally, the Act also allowed the use of steam locomotives, and Edward was keen to use this overall. George was given a £300 salary and an open book policy. He had a patent for cast iron rails, but decided to use malleable iron instead. The new iron was stronger. However, William Losh was furious. He had hoped he would cash in on the rails and the locomotive, but he had to give the best for the project, even at the expense of losing a valued business partner. The void was filled by Edward, and he helped George fund his own works on 4th Street in Newcastle, and a new company was formed, George Stephenson and Company, with his 18-year-old son Robert as a partner. To help with the project, Robert was actually allowed to pause his apprenticeship, and work began. On the 23rd of May 1822, after years of struggling to get any decent transport links, the first rails were laid at St John's in a lavish event. The land around Stockton was flat, so there was minimal obstruction laying the track. George decided to use a 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge. It was favoured by George and had worked well on all of his engines. The rails were unusual, being slightly thinner at the top than its width, and were a mix of 12 foot and 15 foot long. Cast iron chairs would hold the rails in place and were placed on stone sleepers and are fixed with an iron or wooden peg. Wood was the medium of choice as it expanded when a metal nail was driven in, although it was rumoured that George wasn't a fan, calling the wood inferior. Other than the inclines, there were a few other notable challenges. The Skerne and the Gauntless both had to be crossed. The Gauntless Bridge was built first and was one of the first ever iron bridges in existence, and it was made to a lenticular design. However, in 1824 it was damaged in a flood. It was removed and taken back to George's workshop, where it was repaired and a 4th span added. At the same time, the directors were getting concerned. The Skerne Bridge was also destined to be iron. However, with the concerns over the Gauntless, they instructed George to contact Ignatius Bonomi. Ignatius was an architect specialising in design and building of churches. He was also exceptional at building bridges, and he was appointed surveyor of bridges in Northumberland in 1813. He was the ideal person to turn to for advice and guidance. Ignatius knew this bridge must be stronger than anything before. It must withstand vibration, and the loads could vary. What he created could only be described as epic. The abutments would span nearly the entire valley, with one central span to allow the river through. Two smaller spans were also created to allow for surplus water should the river flood. But bridges were not the only railway's greatest feat. Outside of Everley, embankments would be erected that reached over 40 foot high. The builders used machines to help move the soil. They were called earth wagons. It wasn't without incident, however, as the Everley embankment claimed the lives of 2 men as 20 foot of soil collapsed on them. These were the only recorded deaths during construction. However, it's safe to surmise that there may have been more, due to some officials failing to document correctly. It may be impossible to tell. The next obstacle to overcome was on the approach to Darlington. This was called Myers Bog. George decided to tip hundreds of tons of soil to try and make some form of stable plateau. It was called a battery, and it had previous success. The builders got working, but it was tough going. The bog was proving challenging, and as much soil was going in, it was just collapsing. George came down himself to see the problem, and he noted that the coarser plants and bushes had no problem staying on the surface and didn't sink in the mud. He ordered the men to tie the brushwood and lavender bushes together, and together they make the perfect foundation for first the soil and then the rails. The idea worked, and the men crossed the bog on the 11th of June 1825. In the first days of construction, George was never far from the building sites, but as other railway projects began to call on his services, at one point he was engineer and advisor to 4 of them, as well as his local communities and collieries, it was time that the Stockton and Darlington Railway was handed over to his son Robert to finish. Robert was just as smart as his father, and with his exceptional schooling, the railway was in safe hands. Bear in mind, Robert was only 19 at the time. On the 16th of September 1824, the railway asked the foundry to manufacture 2 locomotives, having added to the order of the 3 stationary engines ordered the previous year. However, just like his dad, Robert was being headhunted for other projects, including one that was in South America of all places. With Robert gone for months and George knee-deep with projects, Edward grew worried. It felt that the railway was being pushed aside for better things. Edward decided to appoint Michael Londridge to finalise the project. All the while, the Tees and the Weardale Railway, which were born from the Stocktons' attempts of its own network, was almost complete, and its plan was to bypass Darlington altogether. The plan would shatter the railway's hard work, and was desperately lobbying Parliament to put a stop to the plan. But all of this was putting pressure on the railway's finances. George's budget estimate was already blown away, and the railway had to petition Parliament for an increase of funding by £50,000. With the loss of the Gauntless Bridge and the land costing more than estimated, the railway was in real trouble. Desperate, the railway turned to another well-known Morven engineer, Timothy Hackworth. Timothy wasn't a stranger to the project, having been sent to Forth Street to oversee the running of the foundry. He was, however, on a secondment and was returned back to the colliery to work on his own projects. In March of 1825, Edward approached him directly, and by June he had agreed to join the project for good. The railway's fortunes were finally turning when George was freed up when one of his railways failed through Parliament. The track was ready, so the 2 engineers worked together, Timothy on the stationary engines and George worked on the locomotives, and the 2 men confidently announced that the railway would be complete in just 2 short months.